He wasn't dead. He knew that. He knew that because he could still see, and eventually his hearing had come back, although his head still throbbed miserably. When he finally regained consciousness, he couldn't understand why he seemed frozen in place, unable to move anything but his eyes. He tried to reason it out, but everything was muddled, and he felt sleepy. It was hard to gauge time. He tried briefly to count to 10, but gave up, deciding it was no use, since he couldn't calibrate whether he was counting quickly or slowly. Occasionally, comets seemed to float regally over his head, flaring to brilliance, then slowly fading out as they gently drifted. Brilliant stars chased one another across his field of vision. It all seemed festive and cheerful, but somewhere deep inside he felt an instinctive dread of them, especially the white-hot tracery of the stars. He realized the night was darker now, and that gave him further proof that he was still living, but why couldn't he move? Panic suddenly gripped him. He tried desperately to get to his feet, willing his body to get up, but to no avail. He could hear his breathing coming now in gasps and pants as the panic surged. He tried to move just an arm. Nothing. Wiggle his fingers. Nothing. In growing terror, he turned his head. No, he tried to turn it, but his eyes remained looking in the same direction they had been staring since he had awakened, who knew how long ago. Hysteria and terror poured over him, suffocating him like grave dirt. He wanted to scream, but some primal survival instinct suppressed his urge to cry out, to make any noise at all. Another comet burst forth in brilliance, suffusing everything with a stark, silver-white light and momentarily distracting him. By its light, he became aware of a mist, slowly rising from the mud around him, its vapor shimmering brightly. Again the stars chased one another. Other stars chased each other the opposite direction, crisscrossing the sky like a confused, angry meteor shower. He became aware of the cacophony of a deep, loud, rhythmic booming that accompanied the shooting stars. He heard the sharp snap crack as the stars flew past his head, and the strange, wet thud sizzle when sometimes they flew into the mud near him. The comet abruptly burned out, and for a moment the shooting stars burned all the brighter. Then they too ceased, leaving him alone, in the dark, still unable to move. God, dear God, why can't I move? What's happened to me? He thought over and over as his eyes slowly readjusted to the darkness. He tried again to move, something, anything, but only his eyes were capable of any movement, and they darted desperately through his field of vision, frantically searching the darkness for some clue or explanation for his predicament. But to no avail. He decided to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be... My lips, they're moving. At least they work. I can talk. I can hear myself, he said aloud, but at once regretted making the sound as another comet burned into brightness, and again the mad dash of shooting stars and the raucous rhythm that accompanied them split the darkness. Away to his right, rising up from the mist, he saw a hunched figure. Some of the stars converged on it, and there was a scream as it disappeared back into the thickening vapor. For a flash of a second, he remembered who he was and where he was, but it faded out too fast for him to latch on to anything meaningful. He tried to concentrate, but it made his head throb worse, so he stopped and instead just watched the comet until it went out. A sudden, howling scream tore him back to consciousness. He realized he must have drifted off at some point, but the noise was so pitiable and horrific that he was immediately awake and on his guard. He once again discovered he couldn't move and suddenly remembered it at the same instant. Before he could process the information, the scream again pierced the night. Another comet blossomed overhead, but this time there were no angry streaking stars. He noticed that the mist was much thicker now and hugged the ground more tightly. That made him realize his head was a foot or so above the top of the mist. He tried to work out what it meant, but his attention was distracted by movement out ahead of him. He stared into the distance. A fragment of the mist, tattered and torn, seemed to have risen up above the rest and was slowly drifting away to the left, almost as if it were bobbing or hobbling limply. Occasionally it seemed to stop, almost as if it were listening or sensing somehow. The comet extinguished and he lost sight of it. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. That was what it was, he told himself. Even as he said it, he realized there was something flawed with his thinking. But he couldn't deduce what exactly. He was feeling sleepy again and somewhat giddy. Time passed. He didn't know how long, if he had slept or just floated in the darkness. There was a whooshing sound, and another bright burning comet gently rocked and swayed as it floated on its path. Looking out over the mist, he saw the same ragged fragment, much closer now, only 30 or 40 yards away. It was still bobbing and hobbling, periodically coming to a halt. When it did this, it seemed to slowly turn side to side as if it were searching for something. What the hell is that? He wondered, his grogginess and muddled thinking struggling to process the primal instinctual fear he felt welling up inside his otherwise insensate and numb body. He blinked a few times. It looked like, well, mist. No, it was more threadbare, mangled, shredded, and tattered like an old sheet, or no, it was filmier, more gauzy, like a shroud, he said aloud. The thing snapped around as if it had heard him, which was impossible, he told himself, even as he heard his blood pulsing loudly through his head. He stared at the mist-shrouded, perplexed. It seemed to be moving straight at him now, with halting steps, bobbing as it came. This can't be real. I'm imagining this. Oh, God, maybe I'm in hell. Maybe I died. And what is this thing? His mind raced as the wisp came slowly toward him. Between them, slowly rising out of the thick mist, a hand clawed and struggled upward, its fingers writhing as if mutely imploring God or the devil or anyone for succor from appalling torment. The thing seemed to see it and sprung toward it as the comet snuffed out, leaving him once again in darkness, terror, and confusion. He heard a snuffling in the darkness, like a bloodhound casting for the scent of its prey, then another piercing shriek that died to a sobbing gurgle before going silent altogether. Oh God, oh Jesus, oh Christ, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He heard a wet, tearing sound. His mind froze. He tried desperately to remember the next verse as the tearing noise ended in a sickening pop, followed by a rhythmic crunching. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, he chanted in a hushed whisper, hysterically trying to remember the rest of the prayer. He wanted to stop his mouth from speaking the words aloud, but couldn't, and over their muted rasp he heard the snuffling again, moving side to side, yet coming closer. He willed his mouth to be as unmoving as the rest of his body, but to no avail. The air changed as if a door had been flung open to a long disused cellar. Rank mustiness and decay swamped over him with a chill that was colder than the mist. Another comet popped and flared above him, and there, before him, he saw two red, beady eyes staring at him full in the face. Long teeth chattered and it hissed. A big gray foul rat stood before him, grown fat on unmentionable feasting. Fucking rat, he muttered, almost in relief. Rising up suddenly behind the rat, towering over him so that he could see only part of it, the tattered mist shroud floated toward him. The rat scampered away, squeaking and chirping with frustration and fear. Even in his utmost desperation, he was unable to move. His eyes struggled to see upward at the thing looming over him, but all he saw was a blurry wad of gray as it leaned over and took his eyes. Then he saw only fire and pain and darkness, and a second later, as he screamed, it took his tongue. Shortly after dawn, under a flag of truce, a burial detachment and stretcher bearers came out to collect the remains and the wounded from the night's failed assault. The Turks readily agreed, as, like all Muslims, they had an intense fear and dislike of dead bodies. The Allies readily reciprocated all such reasonable requests. It was a perverse sort of chivalry in the otherwise hellish brutality and vicious butchery of the fighting at Gallipoli. A pair of stretcher-bearers approached him as he lay on the lip of the shell hole. "Poor bugger," the one called Scully said, kneeling beside him. "He's got shrapnel in his back. Here, look, Ginger mate, right here, below his collar. Bloody paralyzed him, I bet. What a bloody awful way to die, God rest his soul." "You seen any good ways of dying out here, short of copping a whiz-bang in the head? Come on, let's take him in. He's out of it, at least," Ginger replied, grabbing the ankles and turning him over. "Jesus wept," Scully gasped as the face rolled into view. Two cavernous, empty sockets where the eyes had been, and an ant-infested, black-crusted hole marked the mouth, minus the tongue. "Fucking rats," Ginger replied, aiming a kick at a bloated and particularly vicious-looking red-eyed brute. They loaded the body onto the stretcher and began the miserable process of carrying him over the slippery, muddy, shattered and broken ground. "Here, you know them Johnny Turks what we brought in last week? One of them spoke proper English and all. He says this here grove's haunted from ancient times. Some sort of demon or the like lives there," Scully said. "Bollocks." "All right, I'm only telling you what he said. I'm not saying I believe it myself. He said there was some demon what lived here, and that in olden times their pagan priests would throw criminals and evildoers down from that peak yonder, and the demon would come out at night and eat 'em. Leastwise, the parts of me wanted to eat, as long as it were fresh." "Scully, mate, you shouldn't be paying heed to the blasphemies of the heathen. Now come on, lift your bloody end up, will you?" "I wonder if that's why the Johnnies kept shooting flares all night after our attack went to ground." "Nah, that was just them and us banging away with the machine guns all night, trying to catch one another off guard in case of a counterattack or the like." "All them traces flying back and forth made for a pretty display, though. Like the fireworks on Guy Fawkes night." "Scully, you don't lift your end up, and I'll give you a penny for the guy right up your backstrap." "Criminy, you're bloody foul this morning." "I'm sorry, mate. Didn't sleep much. I had a bad night. And this poor bugger had a worse one, I'll wager.